The war decree hit the table before I had even swallowed my first bite. I remember the exact moment. I had just lifted a piece of chicken shawarma to my mouth. Real food, not the protein paste the embassy nutritionist kept insisting was nutritionally equivalent. When High Chancellor Voreth of the Ketharan Empire rose from his seat at the far end of the Grand Council table and slammed a crystalline slab onto the surface so hard it rattled every glass in the chamber. The slab glowed a deep, pulsing red. Every alien diplomat in the room straightened like they had been struck by lightning. 1,000 sets of eyes locked onto Voreth. Then, slowly, they turned to me. I finished chewing. I am Mara Voss, ambassador of the Terran sovereignty, appointed to the Ketharan Grand Council 3 years ago after spending 8 years before that in the field, negotiating resource treaties on Proxima Station, mediating border conflicts between species whose names I still occasionally mispronounce, and once spending 4 months in a pressurized habitat eating nothing but synthetic kelp because the supply ship was delayed. The shawarma was the first real food I had eaten in 11 days. I was not going to let a war declaration ruin it. The chamber itself was something that would have taken a human architect a lifetime to design, and a second lifetime to regret. The Grand Council Hall of Dominion 7 was built inside a hollowed asteroid, the interior curved into a perfect dome of black mineral, streaked with veins of pale blue crystal that caught the light and scattered it in slow, drifting patterns across the walls. There were 7 tiers of seating, each occupied by delegates from the 43 species that made up the Ketharan Empire's sphere of influence. The air smelled of something between ozone and burnt copper, which I had learned was how Ketharan recycled atmosphere tasted to human sinuses. It was not pleasant, but I had stopped noticing it by month 2. At the center of the lowest tier, seated at the long obsidian conference table, were the primary delegates. I was the only human in the room. I was also, as far as I could tell, the only one eating. Voreth let the silence stretch. He was good at silence. Most Ketharan officials were. They used it the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, precise and deliberate, designed to open something up. He stood nearly 2.5 meters tall, his exoskeletal frame draped in the dark ceremonial wrapping that indicated his rank. His 4 upper limbs folded in the posture that I had learned meant formal aggression, and his compound eyes, 12 of them arranged in a wide arc across his face, fixed entirely on me. He began to speak. The Ketharan language is not something the human mouth was built for. It lives somewhere between sound and vibration, clicking consonants layered under resonant bass tones that you feel in your chest more than you hear with your ears. My translation earpiece converted it in real time, and the voice it gave Voreth was a flat, even baritone that somehow managed to carry all the warmth of a decommissioned furnace. Ambassador Voss, the translation said, the Ketharan Empire, by the authority of the High Council and the mandate of the Eternal Compact, hereby declares a state of formal war against the Terran sovereignty, effective immediately upon the conclusion of this address. I reached for my water. This declaration is issued on the following grounds. He began to list them. I counted 14. I pulled a folded paper napkin from the inside pocket of my jacket. Yes, I carry paper. The aliens always find it baffling. And I wrote each one down in shorthand. Trade violations. Territorial expansion beyond the agreed boundary markers. Failure to submit navigational data for 3 consecutive review cycles. Alleged interference in the affairs of the Veth Collective, a species under Ketharan protection. Refusal to recognize Ketharan jurisdiction over the Outer Ring asteroid fields. 6 more that were variations on those themes dressed in different language. And the final one, which Voreth delivered with particular weight, persistent demonstration of disregard for Ketharan authority and cultural standing. That last one, I noted, was diplomatic language for the fact that I had once corrected Voreth's mathematics during a public session and had not apologized for it. He finished. The chamber held its breath. I had watched enough of these moments to know what was expected. The panicked scramble of an outmatched diplomat, the sudden paleness, the desperate request for a recess to contact the homeworld, the visible calculation of someone who has just realized they are standing in front of a much larger force and had no idea what to do. I looked up from my napkin. Now, I said. Or after lunch. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one Voreth had built. His was controlled, architectural. Mine was the silence of a room that had stopped knowing what to do with itself. I watched the expressions ripple outward from the table. Confusion, then disbelief, then something closer to alarm. One of the Veth delegates actually stood up halfway before apparently deciding he didn't know why he had done that, and sat back down. Voreth's mandibles, which framed the lower portion of his face, and usually moved in small, rhythmic clicks when he was thinking, went completely still. "I beg your clarification," the translation said. "I'm asking," I said, setting my napkin down flat on the table, "whether you'd prefer to begin the formal response process now, or whether we could schedule it for after I've finished eating. This is shawarma. It took significant logistical effort to get it here. I would prefer not to let it go cold." The delegate from the Oresi Combine, seated 3 chairs to my left, made a sound like pressurized air escaping a valve. I had learned to recognize it as the Oresi equivalent of deeply uncomfortable laughter. Voreth looked at me for a long time. Long enough that I had time to take another bite, chew it thoughtfully, and fold my napkin back into my jacket pocket. "You are not afraid," he said. It came out less like an accusation, and more like a man reading a diagnosis he didn't understand. "I'm annoyed," I said. "There's a difference." What I did not say, what I had no intention of saying in that room, in front of 43 species, with a spy drone almost certainly listening somewhere in the ceiling, was the truth that had allowed me to sit there eating while a galactic empire declared war on my home planet. I had known this was coming for 11 months. Not suspected, known. Our intelligence network, built quietly over a decade of careful diplomatic relationships with species the Ketheron considered too small to worry about, had flagged the preparations 8 months before that. The fleet repositioning, the sudden reclassification of trade disputes as sovereignty violations, the series of carefully worded speeches Voreth had delivered to his own council, each one nudging the language a little closer to justification. And Earth had not panicked. Earth had not scrambled. Earth had done what humans do when they are given enough time and enough reason. Earth had prepared. 3 battle fleets, fully provisioned, sitting at the edge of their jump windows for the past 2 weeks, waiting for exactly this signal. 11 years of quietly reclassified defense research filed under agricultural patents and deep space mining equipment specifications. Alliances built in the margins of every trade negotiation I had conducted for 3 years, with species that Voreth had never once considered worth monitoring. My calm was not recklessness. It was arithmetic. I looked back at my lunch. "I'll take your silence as scheduling flexibility," I said. "Give me 20 minutes. Voreth said nothing. For once in the 3 years I had known him, he appeared to have genuinely run out of words. I ate my shawarma. It was, as I had suspected it would be, very good. 23 minutes later, I stood, straightened my jacket, tucked the napkin with his 14 points of grievance into my pocket, and walked out of the Grand Council Hall, with the same pace I had used walking in. Not fast, not slow, just the pace of someone who had somewhere to be, and was entirely confident they would arrive. The doors closed behind me. I heard, very faintly through the mineral walls, the sound of the chamber erupting into noise. I had expected that. What they were arguing about, I already knew. They were trying to figure out what the calm meant, whether it was a bluff, a breakdown, or something else entirely. The answer was something else entirely, but I would let them work on that for a while. I had a report to file, a treaty invoice to draft, and, if the commissary on the embassy vessel had done its job, a piece of carrot cake waiting for me. The war had been declared. I had things to do. There is a moment in every negotiation, and I have sat through hundreds of them, in habitats that smelled of sulfur, and in orbital chambers where the gravity was just wrong enough to make your inner ear quietly furious, when you realize that the other person in the room has fundamentally misread you. Not just your position, not just your leverage. You, specifically. Who you are, where you come from, what it took to get you into that chair. With Voreth, that moment had come about 8 minutes into our very first meeting, 3 years ago. He had opened by asking me how long humans lived, not as small talk, as a power move. The Ketharon lifespan runs to approximately 300 standard years. He wanted me to feel the weight of that, to understand that I was speaking to a being who had watched governments rise and fall like weather patterns, who measured political time in generations, who could simply outlast any strategy a human diplomat might attempt. I told him we lived about 80 years on average, sometimes 90, occasionally more. He had settled back in his chair with the kind of satisfaction that is almost too obvious to be interesting. I did not correct his assumption. I let him keep it, because the assumption that short-lived species are therefore short-sighted is one of the most reliable thinking errors in the known galaxy, and I had learned very early in my career that an enemy who underestimates you is an enemy who is doing half your work for you. I was born in a small town in northern England, the kind of place where the wind comes off the hills carrying the smell of rain even in summer, where the local pub has been serving the same 4 beers since before my grandmother's grandmother was born, and where people have a particular talent for saying very little and meaning quite a lot. My mother was a secondary school teacher. My father worked for a regional water authority, managing infrastructure for 30 years without once raising his voice in a meeting. He used to say that the loudest person in the room is almost never the most important one. I carried that with me through the Diplomatic Corps training program, through my first posting on Proxima Station, through 8 years of increasingly complex postings that culminated in this one, the highest stakes diplomatic assignment Earth had made since first contact. The Ketharan Empire was not our first encounter with alien civilization. That honor belonged to the Veth Collective, a quiet, methodical species of gas dwellers who had made contact 40 years ago and spent the following decade patiently explaining the galactic neighborhood to a humanity that was still very much adjusting to the idea that the neighborhood existed. The Veth were gentle, curious, and deeply committed to non-interference. They were also, it turned out, under the protection of the Ketharan Empire, which meant that every relationship Earth built with the Veth was technically conducted under Ketharan observation. Voreth's people had been watching us since the beginning. We had always known that. What they had not anticipated was that we were watching back. The Terran Intelligence and Diplomatic Office, which most of us simply called the Office, had been running a sustained observation program since year 2 of contact. Nothing aggressive, no espionage in the traditional sense, just careful, sustained attention. Who was allied with whom? Where the fault lines were in the Empire's coalition? Which species had grievances they'd never been given a forum to voice? Which trade routes were held together more by intimidation than mutual benefit? I had spent 3 years on Dominion 7, not just representing Earth's interests, but building a map. Not a military map, a social one. The Oresi Combine, the ones whose delegate had made that strangled sound when I asked Voreth about lunch, had been chafing under Ketharan trade restrictions for 60 years. They were a small species, bipedal, covered in dense copper-toned scales, with an extraordinary talent for material engineering that the Ketharan had been quietly exploiting through a series of partnership agreements that gave Oresi craftspeople full credit and almost no profit. I had spent 4 months building a genuine relationship with their head delegate, a sharp-eyed woman named Pressa who had the best memory for details I had ever encountered in any species, and a deep, barely concealed fury at the Empire's treatment of her people. The Halvari, a species of 6-limbed burrowers from a high-gravity moon system, had lost 3 colony sites to Ketharan reclassification of territorial boundaries over the past 40 years. Each time, the official record described it as a navigational correction. Each time, the Halvari had submitted formal protests. Each time, those protests had been filed somewhere and never addressed. Their head delegate, a soft-spoken male named Kurith, kept every one of those filed complaints memorized in perfect sequence. He had recited them to me once, in full, over the course of a 2-hour dinner, while eating something that smelled extraordinarily unpleasant, and was apparently considered a great delicacy. I had listened to every word. I had asked questions. I had remembered the answers. The third species, the Nen, a small, fast-moving aquatic civilization that had been conducting trade with the Ketharan for over a century, had a more complicated situation. They were not oppressed, exactly. They were managed. Their entire trade output was routed through Ketharan-controlled distribution networks, which meant the Nen had never once set the price for their own goods. They were comfortable. They were also, in a very real way, trapped. Their lead delegate was a female named Sylvis, who communicated through a translation device that converted her species' bioluminescent signaling into spoken language. She was precise, careful, and had a gift for mathematical analysis that she deployed with quiet devastation in trade discussions. Sylvis had once calculated, in front of a full session, exactly how much wealth the Nen had lost over 90 years of Ketharan-managed distribution, expressed as a percentage of what they would have generated under independent trade. The number was large enough that Vorith had called for an immediate recess. She had sent me the full calculation afterward, through a private diplomatic channel. I had read it 3 times, forwarded it to the office with a note, and begun working on a proposal. These 3 relationships, Pressa, Cureth, Sylvis, were not coincidences. They were the quiet, patient product of 3 years of showing up, listening carefully, and treating every person in every room as someone worth taking seriously. The Ketharan had a word that translated roughly as small-weight species, a term for civilizations they considered too minor to require careful attention. The Oresi, the Halvari, and the Nen all fell into that category. So did humanity, for the first several years after contact. We were short-lived, newcomers, small in number relative to the Empire's oldest member species, and apparently too emotional to be reliable strategic actors. We had leaned into that, fully and deliberately. Every briefing I sent back to Earth during my first year on Dominion 7 contained the same core recommendation. Let them keep thinking that. Do not demonstrate capability. Do not signal readiness. File the standard complaints about minor trade issues, so they have something to dismiss. Show up to sessions slightly late. Eat packed lunches at the conference table. Be, in every visible way, the unsophisticated newcomers they have already decided we are. Meanwhile, in the 12 light years between Dominion 7 and the solar system, humanity was doing what it always does when it has a deadline, a reason, and enough sleep deprivation to push past the point of reasonable caution. It was building. The shipyards at Luna had been running continuous shifts for 9 years, not warships, officially. The manifest records, which were technically available to any registered Empire observer who requested them, listed the construction as extended-range survey vessels and deep-field mining platforms. Both descriptions were technically accurate. They were extended range. They did have mining equipment aboard. They were also armored to a standard that no survey vessel had ever needed, equipped with drive systems that made the Ketharan's fastest ships look like they were moving through wet cement, and crewed by people who had spent 3 years training for exactly the kind of engagement that Voreth had just declared. The weapons systems had been the creative part. You cannot hide a weapons program entirely, not from an empire with the resources to monitor interstellar shipping. What you can do is classify each component separately, file it under a different division, and make sure no single observer ever sees the full picture. A propulsion upgrade here, a sensor array there, hull materials listed as research-grade composites, power generation specifications filed under next-generation atmospheric processing. My father used to say that you could hide almost anything in plain sight if you were willing to be boring about it. The office had taken that principle and turned it into 11 years of defense procurement. The 3 fleets, we called them River, Ridge, and Plain, after geographic features on Earth that I had always found quietly calming, had been assembled over the previous 3 years in 3 separate staging areas, none of which were in Ketharan-monitored space. They had jumped to their current positions 14 days ago, on a pre-scheduled signal that had nothing to do with any observable diplomatic event. When Voreth declared war that afternoon, our 3 fleets were already where they needed to be. He did not know this. He could not have known this, because in all of his careful assessment of humanity, He had made one consistent error. The same error every powerful, long-lived species makes about shorter-lived ones. He thought our brevity made us reactive, impulsive, creatures of the moment, unable to plan beyond the immediate horizon. What he had never understood, what most of the galaxy had never understood, was that a species with 80 years to work with does not waste time. We do not assume there will always be another season to get things done. We learn early, because we have to, that the time you have is exactly as long as you use it wisely. I had used 3 years on Dominion 7 very wisely indeed. As I walked back to the Terran embassy vessel through the connecting corridors of Dominion 7, I pulled out the napkin with Voreth's 14 grievances and read through them again. 3 were legitimate, trade timing issues that our side had let slide during the equipment filing period, which I had flagged and been told to let stand for appearances. 4 were inflated versions of minor disputes that existed in every bilateral relationship in the galaxy, and would ordinarily never survive a standard mediation review. The rest were constructed. Voreth had needed a list long enough to look like a proper declaration, and he had built one. The 14th point, the one about cultural disregard, the one that was really about me correcting his mathematics. I folded over twice so it sat on top of the stack. I planned to address it first in the formal response, with citations, and with the correct calculation included as an appendix. I tucked the napkin back in my pocket and pressed the access panel to the embassy vessel docking bay. My deputy, a young man named Owen Clark who had been with me for 18 months and had the particular talent of looking perpetually on the edge of alarm without ever actually losing composure, was waiting at the airlock with a data pad and an expression I recognized. "We monitored the session," he said. "You asked him about lunch." I did, while he was declaring war. He had also not finished the formal notification paperwork, which technically means the declaration doesn't take legal effect until the paperwork clears the council secretary. I bought us about 4 hours. Owen stared at me. "You knew that before you asked." "Of course I did." He let out a long breath and fell into step beside me. "The comms team has 17 messages from Earth. Command wants a situation report. Admiral Petra Henley's office is asking for a confirmation of fleet go-ahead. Legal wants to know if we should file an emergency stay with the Galactic Compact's arbitration office. Tell comms I'll call Earth in 1 hour. Tell the Admiral the situation is developing as anticipated, and she should hold position. Tell legal that yes, we should file the arbitration request. Not to stop anything, but to create a paper trail that makes us look like we tried every diplomatic option first, which we did." "And the fleet confirmation?" "Not yet," I said. "Let's see if Voreth blinks first." Owen pulled up something on the data pad. "The spy drone in Bay 7 is still active. It's been recording since before you got back." "Good," I said. "Make sure the commissary staff are visible when it's filming. I want them to look like they're setting up for a meal." Owen stopped walking. "You want the drone to film us eating?" "I want the drone to film us eating calmly, yes. While we're at war. While we're technically 4 hours away from being at war, yes. There is a difference. And appearances," I said, starting to walk again, "are currently doing more work than our entire fleet." The corridor lights shifted to the slightly warmer tone that the ship's systems used when we were inside the docking perimeter. I felt the familiar mild pressure change that meant we had crossed from station atmosphere to ship atmosphere, and I took a slightly deeper breath, the way you always do when you are back on home turf. "Owen," I said. "Yes, Ambassador? Is there carrot cake in the commissary?" He checked the data pad. "Apparently yes. Lieutenant Farrow restocked yesterday." "Excellent," I said. "Have them send it to the wardroom. Situation report in 1 hour. Dinner in 20 minutes. What should I tell the 17 messages from Earth?" "Tell them the situation is under control." He glanced at me. "Is it?" I thought about the 3 fleets sitting quietly at the edge of their jump windows, about Pressa and Kurath and Silvus, and the 3 years of careful work that had led to this afternoon, about the look on Voreth's face when I had asked about lunch. "Yes," I said. "We just have to let him figure that out." The wardroom of the persistent argument, which was what my staff had taken to calling our embassy vessel, after a phrase I apparently used too often in sessions, was not built for drama. It had 6 chairs around a bolted-down table, overhead lighting that was pleasant in a deliberately uninspiring way, and a small serving counter along one wall, where Lieutenant Farrow, our ship's logistics officer and unofficial morale coordinator, maintained an operation that was far more sophisticated than its appearance suggested. Farrow was a compact, efficient woman in her late 40s with a complete inability to be flustered by anything, and a talent for producing genuine food in circumstances where genuine food had no right to exist. She had once assembled a full roast dinner for 8 people, using nothing but a field ration kit and 3 hours of dedication, and she held a personal grudge against protein paste that I found professionally appropriate. When I walked into the wardroom, she was setting a plate of carrot cake on the table, with the focused satisfaction of someone completing an important task. "Mission status, Ambassador," she said, without looking up. "Declared war," I said, sitting down, "but not yet legally effective. 4-hour window." "Understood." She placed a fork beside the plate, with the precision of someone who had decided that care in small things was the only reasonable response to a large world. "Tea? Please." Owen came in behind me, followed by 2 other members of my immediate team. Lieutenant Commander Grace Ellison, my communications and intelligence officer, who had a habit of arriving at every room having already thought through most of what needed to be said, and Senior Analyst Declan Webb, who handled all things related to the Ketharan political structure, and who was currently holding a datapad to his chest, the way a person holds something they are not sure whether to share immediately or sit on for a few more minutes. "Sit down," I said to both of them. "Declan, whatever's on that pad can wait until I've had a piece of cake." Declan lowered the pad, glanced at it, then set it face down on the table. "It's not urgent," he said, in the tone of someone who means it's very urgent, but understands that some things are more important. I ate the cake. It was good. Farrow had used real cinnamon, which in the context of a diplomatic vessel orbiting a Ketharan station was something that deserved acknowledgement. "All right," I said, when the plate was cleared. "Grace, what do we have?" Grace pulled up her display. She was methodical, Grace. She had worked with me for 2 years and had adapted to my approach, which she had once described to Owen as controlled unpredictability, which is either very smart or very worrying and possibly both, with the pragmatic flexibility of someone who had decided that results were more useful than method preference. "The spy drone in Bay 7 recorded your return from the session," she said. "It has been transmitting continuously to a relay node on the station's outer ring. The feed includes approximately 40 minutes of footage of our commissary staff preparing this meal, Lieutenant Farrow carrying that cake plate, and Owen looking mildly distressed, which is apparently his baseline." "I object to that characterization," Owen said. "We also picked up a secondary drone that deployed about 20 minutes after you returned," Grace continued. "Smaller, newer model. It's positioned outside the main viewport of the wardroom." I looked at the viewport. It was covered, as it always was when the station's docking corridor was active. "Can it see in?" "No, but it can tell the room is occupied and active." "Good," I said. "Let it listen to us eating dinner. Declan, your turn." Declan flipped the datapad over. "Voreth called an emergency session of his inner council, approximately 14 minutes after you left the chamber. We picked up the comms traffic through Pressa's observation relay. She's been running a passive intercept on the council's secondary channel for about 8 months, with our knowledge." "What did they say?" "There's about 3 minutes of high-confidence translation and about 12 minutes of lower-confidence fragments. The clear section is Voreth describing your response. He used 4 different Ketharan words in succession that all roughly translate to inexplicable. His senior military advisor, Subcommander Veth Arik, suggested that your behavior indicated either a serious mental disturbance or access to intelligence they were not aware of." "Which one did Voreth go with?" Declan glanced at his notes. He apparently said, and I'm quoting the translation directly, "Both possibilities require that we slow down." I sat back. That was better than I had expected. "He's second-guessing the timeline." "That's my read," Declan said. The 4-hour legal window might buy us more than 4 hours if he's genuinely uncertain. What about the fleet tracking? Grace took that one. River, ridge, and plain are all holding position. Admiral Henley acknowledged your message. She's confirmed no movement until your signal. Good. What's the status of the Oresi delegation? Pressa requested a private communication channel about 90 minutes ago, Owen said. I told her you'd be available after dinner. Move that to now. Set it up in the secondary communications room, encrypted class 4. I stood. Grace, I need the full translation of Voreth's inner council session as soon as the lower confidence fragments clear up. Declan, I want your analysis of Eric's tactical recommendation, specifically whether he's the type of advisor who pushes forward when uncertain or pulls back. In my assessment, he pulls back, Declan said. He has a very long career record and a strong preference for complete information before committing. That's useful, I said. Owen, file the arbitration request with the Compact's Secretariat. Standard language, reference Articles 7, 14, and 22 of the Diplomatic Engagement Protocol. Make sure it's time-stamped before the 4-hour window closes. Do we want it to succeed? Owen asked. We want it to exist, I said. Success is optional. Documentation is not. The secondary communications room was a space barely large enough for a chair, a console, and the mild claustrophobia that came with both. I preferred it for sensitive conversations. It had no viewport, no secondary drone access points, and walls that were shielded to a standard that Ketheron intercept technology had not, as far as we knew, learned to penetrate. Pressa's image resolved on the screen after a 3-second encryption handshake. She was in what appeared to be a storage compartment of the Oresi delegation suite, which told me she was taking this seriously enough to step away from any monitoring her own government might have installed in the official rooms. Ambassador Voss, she said. Her translation device had a slightly warmer voice than Voreth's. You asked an interesting question in the council chamber today. I'm told it caused some discussion. Some. Her head tilted in the Oresi gesture I had learned to read as dry humor. Voreth's senior staff used 7 different words for confused before the session was 20 minutes old. I counted. Pressa, I said. I'm not going to talk around what I need to say. The timeline I anticipated has arrived. The work we've been building toward for 2 years is either relevant now or it isn't. I need to know where the Combine stands. She was quiet for a moment. Not hesitant. Pressa was never hesitant. Deliberate. The Combine's council voted 3 weeks ago, she said, before today. We anticipated this too. And? Formal declaration of non-alignment with the Ketheran Empire. To be filed the moment Terran sovereignty confirms active defensive posture, accompanied by a request for the mutual trade framework we discussed in March. I felt something in my chest settle. Not relief exactly. Confirmation. What about military positioning? We have no offensive capability worth discussing, she said. But we have 12 heavy hauler ships currently inside Ketheran-controlled transit corridors. If they were to experience simultaneous navigation system failures requiring emergency rerouting through independent lanes, that would significantly inconvenience Ketheran supply logistics in 3 sectors, I said. Navigation failures are very inconvenient, she agreed. Impossible to predict. How is Kurath? He called me this morning. The Halvari are ready. They will not fight. That is not their nature, but they have filed 17 years of territorial violation documentation with the Compact's legal archive, and they have given us permission to reference it. And Silvas? Pressa's head tilted again, further this time. Silvas presented her government's complete trade analysis to the NIN Council last month. The vote was unanimous. They are terminating their distribution agreement with the Ketheran network effective upon notice. The notice will be filed tomorrow. I sat with that for a moment. In one afternoon, the Ketheran Empire had declared war on humanity. In response, their 3 most exploited trade partners were walking away, filing legal documentation, and jamming supply lines. None of which counted as military aggression, none of which Voreth could respond to with force without violating the Compact's own charter, and all of which had been set in motion months ago. Pressa, I said. When this is over, the Combine's trade framework will be the first thing on my desk. I know, she said. That is why I voted for you to stay in this posting when your first term expired. After the call, I sat alone in the small communications room for a moment. The ceiling was exactly 1.8 meters above the floor and had a faint scratch near the light panel where, 6 months ago, Owen had caught his head while leaning over the console. Little things accumulate in a small space. You learn them without trying. I thought about my father, who had spent 30 years managing water infrastructure in a county most people drove through without noticing, who had never once raised his voice in a meeting, who had told me that the most powerful thing a person can do in a room full of noise is stay quiet and stay certain. I thought about Voreth sitting in his inner council session, using 4 different words for something he could not explain, and his military advisor saying they needed to slow down. I thought about 3 fleets waiting at the edge of their jump windows, patient as hills. Then I got up, went back to the wardroom, poured myself a second cup of tea, and began drafting the formal response to the war declaration. It was written as a negotiation invoice. Line 1 read, "For the inconvenience of preparing for a war we intend to conclude favorably, the Terran sovereignty presents the following accounting of costs, to be addressed in final settlement." It went on for 4 pages. It was polite, precise, fully cited, and exactly as calm as everything else I had done that day. I sent it to Owen to format, went to my cabin, and slept 8 hours without interruption. The spy drone outside the wardroom viewport filmed the lights going out at a reasonable hour. I imagined Voreth reading that report, and I hoped, genuinely, that it helped him understand what kind of opponent he was dealing with. Not a reckless one, not a frightened one, a prepared one. There is a certain quality to the silence before something shifts permanently. I have felt it in negotiating rooms when a position breaks, in corridors outside council chambers when a vote has just been called, in the long breath between a question and an answer that will change everything that follows it. You cannot manufacture that silence. You can only recognize it and make sure you are standing in exactly the right place when it arrives. The silence came 11 hours after Voreth's declaration, at 03:47 ship time, when the comms panel in my cabin lit up with a Priority 1 signal from Admiral Petra Henley aboard the Fleet Command vessel, currently holding position at the edge of the Proxima jump corridor. I was awake before the second pulse. Years of field postings do something permanent to your sleep, sharpening it to the surface so that the right signal finds you immediately. I was dressed and in the communications room in 4 minutes. Henley's face on the screen was the face of someone who had been awake for the full 11 hours and was running on experience and focused intent. She was in her late 50s, solid built, with the particular quality of composure that belongs to people who have made difficult decisions under time pressure, often enough that difficulty itself no longer registers as an obstacle. "Ambassador," she said, "Proxima Station is under approach." I pulled up the tactical display. Proxima Station was our nearest major colony, 6,000 people, a deep space refinery operation, and the most obvious first-move target for anyone opening a campaign against Terran holdings. We had known it would be Voreth's opening. We had prepared accordingly. "How many ships?" I asked. 14 confirmed Ketharon vessels in approach formation. Standard assault configuration. 4 heavy command ships, 8 mid-range interceptors, 2 support carriers. She paused. "They are not moving at full speed." That was interesting. How slow? 60% of standard approach velocity. And they are running full sensor sweeps every 12 minutes, instead of the standard combat protocol, which is every 45. I thought about Declan's assessment of Sub-Commander Arik, a man who pulled back when uncertain, who wanted complete information before committing. "They're looking for something," I said. "They're looking for us," Henley said. "They know something doesn't add up, but they don't know what." "Are the station defenses holding?" "Completely. The pre-positioned mine corridors are in place. The automated suppression grid activated the moment they crossed the outer marker. Their advance formation stalled about 4 hours ago. The lead interceptor took a probe hit from the grid and pulled back. A thin, controlled satisfaction in her voice. They have been stationary for 3 hours and 22 minutes. They're waiting for orders, I said. Arak is waiting for Voreth to tell him what he's looking at. That was my read. Ambassador, River Fleet is ready to move on your authorization. 30-minute jump transit to Proxima. We can be in position before their formation resolves. I looked at the tactical display for a long moment. 14 Ketharan ships. Stalled. Sweeping sensors. Trying to understand a defense that should not exist according to everything they knew about us. 3 human fleets waiting at their marks. A war that was legally effective but practically unstarted. Not yet, I said. Henley looked at me steadily. Ambassador. They're stationary because they're confused. A confused enemy who isn't moving is better than one who is. If we jump River Fleet to Proxima right now, we clarify the picture for them. We give them an enemy to orient toward. I'd rather let them sit with the uncertainty a while longer. And if they stop being uncertain and start moving? Then you'll know before I do, and you have authorization to move River to defensive position without waiting for my signal. But only defensive. No engagement unless they initiate contact with the station. Henley nodded once, the precise nod of someone who disagreed slightly, but respected the reasoning. Understood. What about Ridge and Plain? Hold. I need them where they are. After the call, I stayed in the communications room and pulled up the Compact's arbitration channel. The office had filed our request the previous evening, and the Compact's secretariat had acknowledged receipt at 0100. The arbitration process, under Article 14, required the initiating party, in this case, the Ketharan Empire, to provide formal documentation of all claimed grievances to the Compact's review board within 72 hours of the declaration becoming legally effective. Voreth had filed a declaration built on 14 points. I had spent most of my career dealing with the Compact's review board, and I knew their standards. 4 of his 14 points would survive initial review. The rest would be returned for insufficient documentation, which meant the declaration itself would be technically disputed, which meant any military action he took while the review was pending could be characterized as a violation of the Compact's process protocols. We were not going to win in the arbitration room. I knew that. The Ketharan Empire had been a Compact member for 200 years. They had people who understood exactly how much institutional weight they carried. But winning was never the point of the filing. The point was to create a record, a clear, date-stamped, documented record that showed Earth had pursued every available diplomatic and legal option before its fleet moved a single ship. The galaxy was watching. It always was, and the Ketharan's relationship with the rest of the Compact membership was not as solid as Voreth liked to believe. Long-established powers have a way of accumulating resentments slowly, in the way a riverbank accumulates silt. Nothing dramatic, nothing that changes the look of the river on any given day, but a quiet, steady building that eventually changes the shape of everything. The Halvari documentation that Kurath had given us permission to reference was exactly that kind of silt. 17 years of filed, acknowledged, ignored territorial complaints. The Nen trade analysis that Silvus had spent a career building. The Oresi partnership agreements that anyone who read them carefully would recognize as structured exploitation. None of that was our grievance. We had not been harmed by any of it directly, but we were putting it in front of the Compact's review board anyway, attached to our arbitration filing, as supporting context for the pattern of conduct that led to the current declaration. It was, in the driest possible sense, a gift to every species that had spent decades trying to be heard and hadn't managed it alone. At 0600, Owen knocked on the communications room door and handed me a datapad. Message from the Ketharan Empire's Compact representative. Formal notice of objection to the arbitration filing. Expected. And a separate communication, not through official channels. Personal message. Routed through the Oresi relay. Addressed to you by name. I looked at the routing. It had come from inside the Ketharan delegation, not Voreth's office. A secondary channel I recognized, because I had used it once before, in a different context entirely. The message was from Sub-Commander Eric. It read, Ambassador Voss, my fleet is stationary at Proxima. I have been in this position for 6 hours. I am a thorough person. I do not like finding things I did not anticipate. I am finding many such things. I do not believe this benefits either of our peoples. If you have interest in a preliminary conversation outside formal channels, I am available. I read it twice. Then I looked up at Owen. Get me a private channel to the Ketharan fleet. Arak specifically. Encrypted Class 5. Owen blinked. You want to call the fleet commander who is currently staging an assault on our colony? I want to call the fleet commander who has been sitting stationary for 6 hours, sweeping sensors at 60% speed, and just contacted me through a back channel asking to talk. Yes. Owen went to set it up. I poured myself a coffee, real coffee, which Pharaoh had somehow sourced from somewhere, and thought about what Arak's message actually meant. A Ketharan military commander does not send an unsanctioned message to an enemy ambassador without significant reason. There were 2 possibilities. The first was that Voreth had sent him, as a probe, to test what kind of response he would get. The second was that Arak was acting on his own read of the situation, independent of Voreth's directive. Given what I knew of Arak, cautious, experienced, deeply averse to commitment without complete information, I thought it was the second. I thought he had parked his fleet outside Proxima, swept his sensors for 6 hours, found a defense structure that did not match the profile of a species that should have been easy to intimidate, and quietly begun the process of reassessing. Soldiers of his type do not start wars they are not confident of winning. And right now, Arak was not confident. That was exactly the opening I needed. The encrypted channel connected after a 40-second handshake. Arak's image was less expected than I had anticipated. Not the imposing ceremonial draped figure I was used to seeing at formal sessions, but a Ketharan in operational dress. The exoskeletal frame folded into a compact working posture. The compound eye array slightly dimmed the way they went, when a Ketharan was genuinely focused rather than performing attention. Ambassador, he said. Sub-commander, I said. You've been stationary for 6 hours. There are many things at Proxima Station that were not in our intelligence briefings. Yes, I said. There are. A pause. How long have they been there? 2 weeks, I said. The mine corridors, the suppression grid, the automated response systems. And the rest? What rest? I am a thorough person, he said again. When I scan a defensive installation, and it is more than I was told to expect, I ask what else I was not told. I looked at him steadily. What would you do with an honest answer to that question? The pause this time was longer. His mandibles moved in the slow, deliberate rhythm I associated with Ketharan thinking at depth. Not the quick clicks of agitation, but the even, sustained motion of someone working through something carefully. I would take it to the High Chancellor, he said, and I would advise him that this campaign requires reassessment before any further movement. And would he listen? He is proud, Arak said. Pride complicates listening. But I have advised him for 30 years, and he has overruled me 4 times. 3 of those 4 times he came back to me afterward and said I had been correct. I appreciated the precision of that. 4 times. Not rarely, or occasionally. 4 times. Arak was the kind of person who kept exact counts. Sub-commander, I said, I am going to tell you one thing, honestly, which you can take to Voreth and do with as you see fit. The Terran sovereignty has 3 fully provisioned fleets currently positioned within jump distance of your fleet, and of Ketharan space. They have been there for 2 weeks. They did not move in response to today's declaration. They were already there. Arak was very still. His eye array did not move. Additionally, I said, as of this morning, the Oresi Combine has filed a declaration of non-alignment with the Ketharan Empire. The Halvari have submitted 17 years of territorial documentation to the Compact's Review Board. The Nen Collective has terminated their distribution agreement with the Ketharan Trade Network. These are not actions we asked them to take today. They are the conclusions of decisions those peoples made independently, over many months, for their own reasons. I let that sit for a moment. Now, I said, I am not telling you this to threaten you. I am telling you because you asked an honest question, and you are the type of person who deserves an honest answer. What you do with it is your business. But you asked how long those defenses at Proxima had been in place. The answer is that we have been building toward this conversation for 11 years. And we built toward it because we were paying attention. Arak was quiet for a long time. I will speak with the High Chancellor, he said. I know, I said. I'll be available. The channel closed. I sat back and let out a breath that I had not entirely realized I had been holding. Owen appeared in the doorway. How did it go? We'll know in about 4 hours, I said. Get me Grace. I want to know the moment Arak's fleet changes velocity or course. And if they start moving toward the station, then you call Admiral Henley, and she moves River to defensive position. But I don't think they will. Owen looked at me. What makes you sure? I thought about Eric's face on the screen. The precision of him. 4 times. 3 of those 4 times. Because he's a thorough person, I said, and he just got a lot more thorough. The next 4 hours moved with the particular quality of time that is full of activity but feels strangely still. The way the center of a storm is calm not because nothing is happening, but because everything is already in motion, and there is nothing left to push. Grace tracked Eric's fleet. Owen managed the communications queue, which had grown to 31 messages, most of them from Earth's various governmental bodies, asking for status updates in increasingly urgent language. Declan worked through every available fragment of the Ketharan Inner Council intercepts, building a model of Voreth's decision-making pattern that was, by the time he showed it to me at hour 3, genuinely illuminating. He makes his decisions in steps, Declan said, spreading the analysis across the display. He identifies a position, commits to it verbally in front of his council, and then defends it for as long as he can. The commitment is public, which makes reversal feel like weakness. But, and this is the important part, he does not reverse positions based on pressure. He reverses them based on reframing. Meaning, if you tell him he was wrong, he digs in. But if you present the situation in a way that allows him to make a new decision, that does not require him to acknowledge the old one was wrong, he takes it. 3 of the 4 times Arak overruled him were framed as new information requiring revised strategy, not as errors. So I can't tell him the declaration was a mistake, I said. Not if you want him to change course. I need to give him a way forward that looks like his idea. Or at least like a natural next step from his idea, Declan said. Something that allows the declaration to have been correct at the time, based on what he knew, but which circumstances have now updated. I nodded slowly. That was the shape of it. Voreth had stood up in front of 43 species, made a declaration, and built an identity around it. You could not unpick that directly without destroying the man who made it. But you could build a new structure that made the original declaration look like the first step of a process, rather than the only step. I went back to the negotiation invoice I had started the night before, and began to revise it. By hour 4, Grace was at the door. Eric's fleet has adjusted velocity, she said. They've dropped to 40% of their previous speed. Direction? No change. They're still in position outside Proxima, but at this speed they're not making any approach. They're holding. They're holding. I saved the revised invoice. Get me a channel to Voreth. Direct, official channel. His office, not the council chamber. Do you want me to request the call or announce it? Announce it, I said. Let him know I'm calling. Give him 20 minutes to prepare. Give him time to be ready. Let him be on his ground when we talked. Make every possible accommodation so that when the conversation happened, it was on terms that allowed him to be exactly who he needed to be. Owen, I said, tell Earth's command that I need 4 more hours before I authorize any fleet movement. And tell Admiral Henley that Eric's fleet has slowed and I believe the next step is diplomatic. And if she disagrees? Owen asked. She'll have opinions, I said. She is allowed to have opinions. Tell her I appreciate them and I'll take them fully into account. He smiled slightly. Understood. I went back to my cabin for 10 minutes, washed my face with cold water, changed into a clean jacket, and looked at myself in the small mirror above the sink. I looked, I thought, like someone who had been awake for a long time, but was not going to let that be anyone's problem. The conversation with Voreth was going to be the most important one I had ever had. Not the most dramatic, not the most charged, just the most important, because its outcome was going to determine what the next century of human-galactic relations looked like. I was ready. I want to say something honest about Voreth, because it is important, and because I think history tends to flatten people like him into simple shapes that do not reflect what they actually are. He was not stupid. He was not simply arrogant. He was the product of a system that had rewarded the particular blend of confidence and authority he embodied for several hundred years, that had positioned his species at the center of a vast empire, and told him, consistently, that the reason for that position was inherent, rather than circumstantial. When you are told often enough, and by enough credible voices, that you are the natural order of things, you eventually stop distinguishing between what you have built and what was simply given. The call connected at 1400 station time. His chambers were different from the council hall. Smaller, more private, lit in the deep amber tones that Ketharan interior spaces use to indicate a residential, rather than ceremonial setting. He was seated, rather than standing, which was, in Ketharan body language, a signal of willingness to engage, rather than dominate. I noted that. It mattered. Ambassador Voss, he said. High Chancellor, I said. Thank you for taking my call. You are the one who asked for it. Yes. I wanted to speak with you directly, without the chamber, without the full council. I find those settings useful for certain things, but not for honest conversation. A pause. You are calling to discuss terms. I'm calling to give you information, I said, which I think you do not yet have in full, and which I believe would change how you understand the current situation. You are referring to your military positioning. So Eric had already spoken with him. Good, among other things. Arak told me about your fleets. His mandibles clicked once, then settled. He also told me about the Oresi, the Halvari, and the Nen. That information is accurate. When did you begin building these alliances? 3 years ago, when I arrived at Dominion 7. I paused. I want to be very clear with you about something, High Chancellor. I did not build those relationships in order to use them against you. I built them because Pressa and Curath and Silvus are intelligent, capable people representing their civilizations, and it seemed to me that treating them seriously was simply the correct thing to do. The fact that treating them seriously turned out to also be strategically sound is a coincidence, but I will not pretend it is an unhappy one. He was quiet for a moment. You corrected my mathematics during a public session, he said. I had wondered when that would come up. You had made an error. The trade volume projection was off by a factor of 1.4. If I had let it stand, the agreement based on it would have cost the Oresi Combine an amount that I believe you would not have intended. You could have raised it privately. I could have, I said. I chose not to. I made a judgment call that the session was the appropriate place to correct the record, and I stand by it. I understand it reflected poorly on you in front of the council. I am not going to apologize for the correction. I will, if it helps, acknowledge that I could have been more considerate about the manner. A longer silence. That is the most unusual apology I have received in 300 years of diplomacy. It is not quite an apology, I said. It is an acknowledgement of manner while maintaining the substance. There is a difference. Yes, he said. There is. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said, High Chancellor, I have a proposal. Not terms of surrender, not a counter-declaration. A proposal. Go on. I opened the document I had been building for the past 12 hours. The revised negotiation invoice, reworked entirely based on Declan's analysis of how Voreth moved through decisions. It was no longer an invoice. It was a framework. It began, given that the current state of declared conflict was initiated based on intelligence assessments that have since been significantly revised by new information, and given that both the Terran sovereignty and the Ketharan Empire share an interest in regional stability and the integrity of the Galactic Compact's mediation framework, The following framework is proposed as a path toward resolution that does not require either party to abandon its formal position, but allows both to achieve their underlying objectives. I walked him through it point by point. The 3 trade disputes that were legitimate, our fault, genuinely, we would address. Specific timelines, specific remediation, specific verification process. Not because we had to, but because they were legitimate. The territorial markers, we proposed an independent survey, jointly requested to the compact, with results binding on both parties. This gave Voreth a path to the expanded boundary markers he had wanted, without requiring him to claim them through military action, which would have been more expensive and less permanent. The Veth collective situation, we proposed a formalized consultation protocol that acknowledged Ketharan protective authority, while establishing clearer parameters around what interference meant, which incidentally resolved 3 outstanding Veth complaints about Ketharan administrative overreach that the Veth had been too polite to raise directly. The Oresi, Halvari, and Nen situations. This was the delicate part. I did not present these as consequences of Voreth's conduct. I presented them as a related but separate matter that had reached a natural resolution point, coincidentally with the current situation, and which the framework could address as part of a broader regional stabilization package that would, if managed well, actually strengthen the Ketharan Empire's standing within the compact rather than diminishing it. The logic was simple. An empire that voluntarily reformed 3 exploitative trade relationships, documented through a compact-mediated process, gained moral authority. Moral authority, in the long run, was worth more than the income from those relationships. I did not tell Voreth that the Oresi, Halvari, and Nen had already essentially made their decisions. I let him believe the framework could influence outcomes that had already been determined. The outcomes were good for everyone. His belief that they were influenced by his decision gave him something to take back to his council. He listened to all of it without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When I finished, he said, "You drafted this after I declared war on your people." "I drafted most of it before," I said honestly. "I revised it this morning based on new information. New information from Eric. Among other things. You knew what Eric would do when he reached Proxima. I knew what a thorough person would do when they encountered a defense structure that did not match their expectations," I said. I had some confidence in his thoroughness. His mandibles moved in the long, even rhythm. Thinking. "The 14th point," he said. "Cultural disregard." "Yes." "What do you propose for that one?" I had thought about this for 3 years. I knew what he was actually asking, not about cultural disregard in the abstract, but about the specific, personal moment in that council chamber when I had publicly corrected him, and what it meant, and whether anything in our relationship after that could be built on honest ground. "I propose nothing for it formally," I said. "Formally, it does not meet the compact's standard for a declared grievance, and I expect the review board to return it. Personally, I will tell you what I told Iraq. We have been watching carefully for 11 years. We built our preparations specifically because we took your empire seriously, as a force to be reckoned with. We corrected the mathematics because we take accuracy seriously. Both of those things are, in their way, a form of respect. The Ketharan Empire is not an empire that should be treated as a minor concern. I never treated it as one. I simply also did not treat it as an authority that was beyond correction." A very long silence. "Ambassador Voss," Voreth said, "I have spoken with many human diplomats in 40 years of contact with your species. You are the first one I have not been able to predict. I'll take that as a compliment." It was meant as one. A pause. "I will need 48 hours to review this framework with my council." "Of course. RX fleet will remain stationary during that period. Our fleets will remain in position as well. No movement, no action." "And the arbitration filing?" "Remains on the record," I said. "It can be withdrawn as part of the final framework execution, or it can run its course. Either way, it has served its purpose." He made a sound I had not heard from him before, something between a click and a sustained low tone that my translation earpiece rendered as an untranslatable marker. the kind that appears when a language does something that does not map to any concept in the target vocabulary. I had learned, over 3 years, that these untranslatable markers were often the most interesting moments in any Ketharan conversation. They were the sounds that came out when the speaker was being entirely, privately honest. 48 hours, I said. Take the time you need. The channel closed. I sat in the communications room for a moment. Outside, I could hear the ordinary sounds of the ship. Pharaoh in the commissary, Owen managing the message queue, the faint mechanical rhythm of the life support systems doing their steady, indispensable work. I sent a brief message to Grace. Fleets hold. No movement. And a separate message to Pressa, stand by. News in 48 hours. Then I went to find something to eat. It had been, by my count, about 26 hours since the shawarma in the council chamber. I was not making a point anymore. I was simply hungry. Pharaoh had left a plate of soup and bread on the counter with a sticky note that said, "Eat this, Ambassador, or I will have opinions about it." I ate it standing up, reading through Owen's summary of the 31 messages from Earth, noting which ones needed personal responses and which ones could be handled by form. A message from my mother had somehow gotten into the diplomatic queue, forwarded through 3 relay stations from a planet 12 light-years away. It read, "Saw the news coverage. They mentioned you asked about lunch. Very you. Call when you can. Love, Mum." I smiled at that. Actually smiled, the way you do when something lands exactly right without trying. I wrote back 3 words. I was hungry. Then I sat down, finished the soup, and waited for Voreth. The 48 hours passed with a quality I can only describe as productive tension, the kind of time that moves purposefully without drama, where every hour contains something necessary, and nothing is wasted. Owen organized the messages from Earth into categories: governmental bodies that needed formal updates, media inquiries that needed standard responses, and the occasional personal communication that had slipped through. I handled the governmental ones personally, keeping each response brief and consistent. The situation was developing. Diplomatic engagement was ongoing. Fleet positions were unchanged. No action was anticipated. All of that was true, in the way that very carefully chosen words can be true while leaving a great deal implied. Grace ran continuous monitoring on Eric's fleet position and the Ketharan Inter-Council comms channel. The fleet stayed stationary, not just slower but genuinely stopped, running maintenance cycles in deep space while Voreth's council worked through the framework I had sent. The inter-council intercepts were limited, but what came through suggested a sustained, serious discussion, rather than the sharp, reactive sessions that had followed the original declaration. Declan spent the time building a detailed analysis of every prior Ketharan external agreement that had involved third-party species, mapping the patterns of how they had structured settlements in the past. By hour 36, he brought me a document that was, without exaggeration, one of the most useful things I had read in 3 years. The Ketharan settle in one of 2 modes, he said, spreading the analysis. Either they negotiate from a position of obvious superiority and extract maximum concessions, or they negotiate from a position where the outcome is uncertain and they seek something they can call a win, even if the substance is a compromise. In the second mode, they are actually quite flexible about substance. They prioritize the narrative. They need a story they can tell their council, I said. And, to the other 43 member species, he said, there is a performance aspect to this that I think we have been underweighting. Voreth declared war publicly, in front of witnesses. However he ends this, it needs to be something his council can characterize as an outcome they shaped, not an outcome they accepted. I thought about the framework I had sent him, specifically the sections I had drafted so that Voreth's decisions appeared to drive the resolution, the independent boundary survey that he would request, the consultation protocol for the Veth that carried his authority, the trade remediation that Earth would provide on a timeline that he set. Does the framework give him that? I asked. Declan studied it for a moment. Mostly. The Oresi and Halvari and Nen situations are the weakest point. Those look like consequences of his conduct, not decisions he made. How do I reframe that? He thought for a long moment. What if those resolutions were presented as part of a broader regional initiative that he is endorsing rather than conceding to? A compact-mediated regional review of bilateral agreements across the Empire's trade network, requested jointly by the Ketharan Empire and the Terran sovereignty. He looks like a reformer, not someone who was forced to change. I looked at him. That's genuinely good. I know, he said, with the calm of someone who is very competent and has made peace with it. I revised the framework that evening, restructuring the third-party species section along exactly those lines. A joint request to the Compact for a regional trade review. Comprehensive, voluntary in its framing, beneficial to everyone, including the Ketharan, whose standing in the Compact would improve measurably if they were seen to lead it rather than submit to it. I sent the revised version to Voreth's office at hour 38, with a brief note explaining the change and why I believed it served both our interests. At hour 41, his office sent back a single-line acknowledgement, received, under review. At hour 46, Pressa contacted me. She was in a more formal setting this time, her actual office rather than a storage closet, which told me the situation had shifted enough that she felt comfortable being visible about the communication. The High Chancellor's Council held a full session this morning, she said. I was not in the room, but two of my contacts were present as administrative observers. What happened? The session lasted 4 hours and 40 minutes. The vote at the end was 11-3 in favor of the revised framework. She paused. The 3 votes against were from the hardline military bloc. Arak abstained, which in Ketharan Council terms is closer to a vote in favor than a vote against. 11-3, and Arak abstaining. When is Voreth going to call me? I asked. Pressa made the sound of dry humor. Within the next hour, I would estimate. He is probably composing his opening statement very carefully. Of course he is. I glanced at the time. Pressa, after this is finished, when the framework is signed and the compact review is underway, I want you to know that everything we discussed is on the table. The Oresi trade framework, the partnership terms, all of it. I know, she said. I have known that since the day you sat down with me and actually listened to the numbers. After the call, I changed into my formal diplomatic jacket, the one with the Earth sovereignty insignia on the collar that I wore for sessions where appearance was doing a portion of the work, and went to the main communications room, which had better audio and a wider display than the secondary room. I asked Grace to stand by on monitoring and Owen to be available in the corridor. Voreth called at hour 47, as Pressa had predicted. He was in the ceremonial chamber this time, in formal wrapping, his inner council visible in the background. The staging was deliberate. He was making this official. For the record, in front of witnesses. That was a good sign. People only perform official resolutions when they intend to honor them. Ambassador Voss, he said. High Chancellor. The Ketharan Grand Council has reviewed the revised framework submitted by the Terran sovereignty. He was reading from a prepared statement, which he held just below the camera angle, with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this for 300 years. Following full deliberation, the Council finds the framework to be a sound basis for the resolution of the current state of declared conflict, subject to the following modifications and conditions. There were 7 conditions. I had anticipated 5 of them. The other 2 were about procedural details that I genuinely had not considered, and both of which, when I thought about them, were actually improvements to the framework. I accepted all 7. The Ketharan Empire will further propose, jointly with the Terran sovereignty, a comprehensive review of bilateral trade agreements across the Empire's regional sphere, to be conducted under the auspices of the Galactic Compact's mediation framework. Voreth continued. This was the section Declan had revised. He was reading it as if it were his own language, which in a sense it now was. The Terran sovereignty welcomes this proposal and offers its full support, I said. The formal language continued for another 12 minutes. The legal architecture that would govern the ceasefire, the timeline for remediation of the legitimate trade issues, the parameters for the boundary survey, the withdrawal of our arbitration filing upon successful framework execution, and the restoration of normal diplomatic status to all parties. At the end of it, Voreth set down his prepared statement. For a moment he was just looking at the camera, at me, without the text in front of him. "Ambassador," he said. "High Chancellor. My military advisor told me something after your conversation with him." A pause. "He told me you had said we had been building toward this conversation for 11 years. That you had been paying attention." "Yes. He also said you had described our fleet as something worth taking seriously. That your preparations were a form of respect." "That is accurate." He was quiet for a moment. His mandibles moved in the long, even rhythm. "I have governed this empire for 80 years, he said. In that time, I have encountered many species. Most of them, when faced with a choice between understanding and prevailing, choose prevailing. You are unusual." "We had time to prepare," I said. "Time to understand. It seemed like the better investment." "And the question about lunch?" I almost smiled. The declaration had a 4-hour processing window before it took legal effect. I needed you to wonder about what the calm meant. The best way to make someone wonder is to give them something genuinely surprising, and then refuse to explain it. He made the untranslatable sound again, longer this time. "That is," he said, "extremely annoying." "I know," I said. I considered something more dramatic, but I was actually hungry. A pause. Then, and I could not have predicted this, would not have predicted it in any version of this conversation I had rehearsed. Voreth made a sound that my translation earpiece rendered as untranslatable. Contextual markers suggest humor. It lasted about 4 seconds. I did not push it. I let it be what it was, a small, genuine thing in the middle of something very large. "The framework will be executed through formal channels," he said, returning to the official register. "The compact secretariat will be notified by end of the current standard day." Agreed. Ambassador Voss. "High Chancellor, next time you come to the council chamber," he said, "bring enough for 2. The channel closed. I sat for a moment in the main communications room, alone, with the display showing an empty frame and the ship's systems running their continuous, steady cycles around me. The monitoring displays showed Eric's fleet on the move, heading back toward Ketharan space at standard cruise velocity. Navigation lights active, no weapons signatures. I sent a 3-word message to Admiral Henley, "Stand them down." Then I sent a message to Grace, "Please let the Aresi, Halvari, and Nen delegations know that the framework is confirmed. Separate messages, appropriate language for each, personal from me." Then I sent a message to Owen, "Tell Earth the situation is resolved. Formal documentation to follow." Then I sat there for another few minutes, not doing anything in particular. Outside the ship, I knew, the galaxy was already starting to process what had happened. The 43 species in that council chamber had watched a human ambassador ask an empire about lunch, and then watched that empire's war fleet sit stationary outside a human colony for 2 days before going home. Every intelligence network in the known galaxy was filing reports. Every diplomatic corps was revising its assessment of the Terran sovereignty. I was not naive about what that meant. Reputation in the galaxy is a resource, and we had just acquired a great deal of it very quickly. That resource would create its own pressures, its own expectations, its own complications. Species that had been watching from the margins would begin approaching us. Species that felt threatened by our sudden emergence would begin their own quiet preparations. The Ketharan Empire would honor the framework, I believed, but the internal politics of what had just happened would take years to settle. None of that was today's problem. Today's problem, or rather, today's solution, was complete. I stood up, stretched in the way that you do after a very long time in a small room, and walked to the wardroom. Pharaoh was there, because she always seemed to be there when the important things happened, arranging something on the serving counter with her characteristic focused competence. On the table was a plate. Shawarma. Fresh, still warm, wrapped in the way that indicated actual care in the preparation. Where there was also, beside it, a piece of carrot cake. "Commissary resupply came through," Pharaoh said, without looking up. Thought you might want to finish what you started. I sat down. I picked up the shawarma. I took a bite. It was, as I had known it would be, exactly worth waiting for. The war had been declared and resolved. 3 species had taken their first steps towards something better. An empire that had spent centuries treating its neighbors as variables had been given, gently and firmly, the information it needed to reconsider. And humanity had demonstrated, in the most quietly effective way available to us, that the species that asks about lunch is not the species to be underestimated. I ate slowly. I had nowhere else to be. Outside the wardroom viewport, uncovered now, station docking lights off, open space beyond, the stars were exactly as they had always been, indifferent, enormous, crowded with civilizations each living their own incomprehensibly complex lives. The galaxy was old and full and not particularly interested in any individual moment. But individual moments, I had found, had a way of mattering anyway. I finished the shawarma. I started on the carrot cake. Pharaoh, without being asked, poured me a cup of tea. "Well?" she said. "Well?" I said. "We got it done." She nodded once, with the satisfaction of someone who had never doubted it, but was pleased to have the confirmation. I drank my tea. 11 years of preparation. 3 years of relationship building. 47 hours of the most important negotiation of my career. An empire that had declared war, and then, slowly, thoughtfully, decided that was not the direction it wanted to keep moving in. And 1 piece of shawarma, eaten in 2 sittings, across the span of a near war. My mother was right. It was very me. I would call her when I got back to Earth. I would tell her it had gone fine. She would ask if I had eaten properly. I would tell her about the shawarma. She would say that was not what she meant. And I would say that sometimes the most important thing you can do, in the middle of everything the world throws at you, is remember to eat your lunch. Because the person on the other side of the table, whoever they are, whatever they want, whatever they have decided about you before you even open your mouth, they are watching what you do when the pressure is on. And what you do when the pressure is on tells them everything they need to know. I had told Voreth, without saying a single word about it directly, that I was someone who had done the work, made the plans, built the relationships, and arrived at that table so prepared that a war declaration was, genuinely, a scheduling inconvenience. That was not arrogance. That was 11 years of not wasting time. I finished the cake. Outside the viewport, the stars kept doing what stars do, burning, steady and patient and completely unimpressed. I was, just then, extremely glad to be human.